Frontiers in Soviet History: How Perestroika and Glasnost Changed the World Order. Perestroika and Glasnost, revolutionary reforms introduced in the 1980s in the Soviet Union by Mikhail Gorbachev to modernize and democratize the Soviet Union in the form of new capitalist policies and more freedom of speech, were groundbreaking frontiers that resulted in the lifting of the Iron Curtain, fall of communism in Eastern Europe, end of the Cold War, and nuclear disarmament between the US and the USSR. But unfortunately, the same reforms led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, weakening Russia, hurting the pride of Russian nationalists, fueled by the expansion of NATO at Russia's border, ultimately sowing the seeds for today's Russia-Ukraine conflict. Following World War II, the Soviet Union established a strong sphere of influence in Eastern Europe by establishing communist regimes in several countries, including Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, and East Germany. The Soviet Union had a strong military presence in these countries and exerted economic, cultural, and political control. These communist countries were often referred to as Eastern Bloc or Second World, in contrast to the capitalist First World, which referred to US and Western European countries. This world order was established soon after the Second World War, marked by a bitter rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, broadly recognized as the Cold War between the two superpowers of the world. During the period of the Cold War from 1947 to 1991, both the United States and the Soviet Union invested heavily in the development of advanced weapon systems, including nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines, and space-based military technologies. The rapid escalation in the arms race led to an enormous stockpile of nuclear arsenals with both superpowers. The two superpowers also fought prolonged proxy wars in North Korea, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. The world came perilously close to nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1961. The escalating arms rivalry put enormous pressure on the Soviet economy. Excessive spending in the defense and aerospace sectors led to poor growth in agriculture, consumer goods, and healthcare services. The outcome was production shortages and the failing living conditions of the Soviet population. The Soviet economy in the late 70s was mostly stagnant, marked by inflation, food shortages, and a lack of consumer goods. There were long lines outside of stores, hours spent waiting in the cold, and tales of people resorting to bartering to get what they need. In addition to the poor standard of living, the common man in the Soviet Union also started realizing the lack of freedom and lack of government transparency compared to their Western counterparts. The freedom to move within or outside the country was limited, so was the freedom to practice religion or express any political dissent. This was against the backdrop of the brutal purges of millions of citizens during Stalin's rule, which established a complete sense of fear and unwillingness to speak against the government. Mikhail Gorbachev, a Communist Party politician, took power in 1985 against this growing discomfort among Soviet citizens, as well as the failing economy.
The state of the Soviet Union and its society could be described very simply with a phrase used by people across the country. We can't go on living like this any longer. That applied to everything. The economy was stagnating, there were shortages, and the quality of goods was very poor.
Gorbachev believed that economic and political reforms were necessary in order to modernize and revitalize the Soviet Union and improve the standard of living for its citizens. He openly acknowledged that Soviet citizens had a poor standard of living compared to their Western counterparts, and that they had limited access to the latest technologies and consumer goods. In order to address these challenges, Gorbachev introduced a number of reforms collectively known as Perestroika and Glasnost. His goal was to take the Soviet Union out of the economic and political deadlock while still preserving socialism. Perestroika means restructuring. Gorbachev wanted to loosen the party's grip on the economy so that people would be able to buy and sell goods at a profit with no interference from the state. Through Glasnost, that's openness, he wanted people to feel free to speak their minds, question the past, and prepare the way for a more honest government. This was Gorbachev's way of handing power back to the people.
Glasnost means simply that we, journalists, could write what we wish. And so Glasnost reintroduced feedback from the society to the top.
Право жить в условиях мира и свободы – это главное право человека.
Rights denied for 70 years were allowed. Banned music, books, newspapers, and theater became suddenly available. The signs of freedom became visible throughout the Soviet Union as citizens were granted the right to protest, travel, immigrate, and openly practice their religion. The Iron Curtain was flung open as many reveled in their newfound freedom. As the reforms continued, Gorbachev proposed to end the arms race and establish warmer diplomatic relations with the West. He met with President Reagan, and relations indeed improved. In his 1988 Red Square speech, Reagan said that he no longer saw the USSR as the evil empire. Enemies became friends. In December 1989, at a summit meeting in Malta, Bush and Gorbachev announced that the Cold War was over.
For 40 years, the Western Alliance has stood together in the cause of freedom, and now with reform underway in the Soviet Union, we stand at the threshold of a brand new era of U.S.-Soviet relations.
In 1991, the Soviet Union and the United States signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which aimed to reduce the number of strategic nuclear weapons in the two countries' arsenals.
In those days in Europe, there were two powerful blocs opposing each other. It was like sitting on a powder keg. If it had exploded, it's difficult for me to even think about it.
After the Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986 and the government's failed attempt to hide the severity, Gorbachev intensified the Glasnost policies and government transparency. A government commission investigated Stalin-era repression and made its findings public. The greater freedom of press also allowed many books and films about Stalin's reign of terror. Glasnost, Perestroika, and democratization reforms also spread to the Eastern Bloc countries. As the reforms continued, the Soviet Union abandoned the policy of military intervention in support of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and encouraged these countries to decide their future. This, along with political freedom, led to multi-party systems and democratic elections in these countries.
Покончили с монополией одной партии, вышли к политическому плюрализму, экономическому, признали инакомыслие, и, наконец, завершилось это самой мощной.
On November 9, 1989, thousands of jubilant Germans brought down the most visible symbol of division at the heart of Europe, the Berlin Wall. For 2 generations, the wall was a physical representation of the Iron Curtain. As the wall came down and the fears of a Soviet reaction receded, the dominoes started falling at a quickened pace. By the summer of 1990, all of the former communist regimes of Eastern Europe were replaced by democratically elected governments. With newfound political freedom and democratic rights acquired through Perestroika and Glasnost, the Soviet republics also started to demand independence from Moscow. After a failed coup by the Communist Party to overthrow democracy in August 1991, all states of the Soviet Union declared independence. With every constituent declaring independence, the USSR was finally dissolved on December 26, 1991. During the Cold War, the two superpowers had accumulated enough nuclear weapons to wipe out life on Earth many times over. However, the ideas of Perestroika and Glasnost proved to be more powerful than all the nuclear weapons, and ended the Cold War without any bloodshed. Perestroika and Glasnost were powerful frontiers that proved that the human spirit, fueled by the desire for freedom and change, can triumph over even the most catastrophic and destructive forces of the modern world. Unfortunately, the fall of the Soviet Union was followed by an aggressive expansion of NATO by the West to the former communist countries, as well as to the countries that were earlier part of the Soviet Union. This went directly against the US's promise to not expand NATO 1 inch eastward. This created an environment of betrayal, fear, distrust, and humiliation among Russian leaders, stoking nationalism and the desire to regain Soviet glory. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is reflective of this fear and humiliation, reminding us of an eerily similar sentiment seen in Germany after its defeat in the First World War and subsequent humiliation as part of the post-war treaty. Although Russian nationalism and aggression is rearing its head, Perestroika and Glasnost were frontiers in modern history with many positive effects, and serve as a reminder that even the most complex and challenging problems can be overcome through the power of ideas. However, many believe that a large part of the Soviet Union has returned back to its old repressive and one-party rule, threatening to challenge the world order and the conquest to restore its old glory.